But the most common question was, why would you join up? Which is rather astonishing. The only thing I can think of in response to that to tell them was that it was the right thing to do.
Of course, we knew that Hitler had what he was up to.
So everybody was saying, hey, we got to stop this guy.
Maybe it was a different time then. There was a sort of, to me anyway, a kind of sense of duty that if the country was at war and they wanted you to go, then you should go.
My mother didn't want me to go because she says one son is enough. But I said, well, I'm going to go sooner or later, so I don't want anybody to do the fighting for me.
I have a hard time talking about it even yet without getting a little emotional.
I guess the most vivid memory was when I took the first bullet that was fired at me.
It was an opportunity to prove that one could be the best at what you do. And one always wanted to measure up, that's it.
They were young, with minds filled with adventure and bravery deep in their souls.
They had to be stopped. We had no choice but to go to war.
They didn't seem to understand that they were up against a different type of soldier.
Who were these men who would jump from an aircraft behind enemy lines?
He shot me with a rifle, and he didn't kill me, thank goodness.
Drawn together by a cause, a brotherhood bound by blood, delivering victory from above. Leonardo da Vinci was not likely thinking death from above when he sketched the first crude concept drawing of a parachute in 1483. 300 years later, Benjamin Franklin visualized an infinite deal of mischief when he wrote, hypothetically, of soldiers dropping into combat behind enemy lines. The Russians experimented with airborne troop insertions into battlefield exercises between the First and Second World Wars. The Germans took notice and improved upon it. The German Fallschirmjäger at the outset of World War II in Poland, Holland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and Crete were the first paratroops to prove the concept of vertical envelopment. Ruthless commandos striking behind enemy lines at command and logistics facilities, their blitzkrieg demoralizing frontline enemy troops by eliminating the security of a safe rear area. The British and Americans saw the light and developed airborne troops in 1941. Canada decided to get on board in 1942. Canada's original paratroopers were volunteers, Canadian soldiers already in England and others in Canada. Those in England began training in July 1942 at Ringway. Those in Canada went to train at Fort Benning in Georgia. And in the spring of 1943, training was moved to Camp Shiloh in Manitoba. With no further need for paratroops in Canada, the British Army was pleased to accept Canada's battalion in their 6th Airborne Division. On arrival in England, the battalion converted to the British style of parachuting without reserve parachutes. They jumped from towers, from balloons, and from a variety of aircraft modified to drop airborne infantry. The initial wave of volunteers, young men fresh out of high school and in their early 20s. They put aside personal dreams and aspirations to enlist, but few volunteers would be accepted in the elite new airborne force. Only 1 in 3 volunteers made it through the initial screening. Another third were lost in basic training. The conditioning was physically intense. The battlefield skills acquired deadly aggressive. This first generation of Sky Commandos knew the high risks of being the first into combat, landing behind enemy lines, outnumbered by the hostile forces around them, using tactics that were still largely unproved. Despite the deadly odds, there was no shortage of men who wanted to wear the maroon beret and silver paratrooper's wings.
I was with the militia before the war for 3 years.
I had been a trained machine gunner and an NCO who was responsible for training other people.
When I started out, I was in the in a reconnaissance regiment and volunteered to go to the airborne.
I ran into two high school buddies of mine from Toronto, who I knew quite well, and they filled me with a lot of enthusiasm for the battalion, for the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, which had only arrived in England about 3 months before.
Walking down the street in Toronto, I saw some paratroops. So oh, they look smart. That looks good to me. So I signed up for the paratroop.
Why would you want to get into the Parachute Battalion? Well, it was, I guess the simplest thing to say is that it was an opportunity to prove that one could be the best at what you do.
As a matter of fact, the battalion, when it was formed at Fort Benning and took exactly the same training as the Americans did.
Canada didn't have any airborne training school.
When the tower and the facilities at Shiloh were finally built and completed, and training continued there, it was patterned after the American training.
And we were there for a few months, and then we went overseas.
Well, the battalion first went over in July 1943, trained with the British, the 6th Airborne Division, the 3rd Brigade.
We were put in the British 6th Airborne Division and stationed in the Salisbury Plains around Bulford. From there, we were retrained again. We went up to the British Parachute Training School in Ringway. They used a slightly different method of jumping, and we went through the training there.
Which was out of a balloon in England, and there was no reserve chute. And you drop 180 feet before the chute opens. And I know I was frozen, and my jaw was clenched. I said, when the hell is this thing going to open?
In all, we had to do 8 parachute jumps, 3 from a barrage balloon with a basket suspended beneath it. That was 3 jumps. And then you did 5 jumps from an aircraft.
They trained out of converted bombers, and they had a hole in the bottom of the plane, like about 3 foot diameter. The secret, well, that was like the balloon drop too. It was out of a round hole. And if you didn't arch yourself and throw and clear your parachute from the edge of the hole as you went down, the parachute caught the edge of the hole, flipped you forward, and you rang the bell and busted your nose. So the trick was to do it right, or otherwise there was a lot of broken noses.
And I think only the last 2 jumps for qualification were done from the famous old Dakota C-47, which was a sheer pleasure to jump from. It was much easier, simpler, and better all round.
I'd waited since 1939 to get into action, not wondering really, I suppose, what my reaction would be in getting into battle for the first time. But of course, then there was the personal thought, am I going to be able to carry this off as I should?
One Can Para has been honored with a monument in Wasaga Beach and a plaque in Etobicoke for Corporal Frederick George Topham, the battalion's only recipient of the Victoria Cross. Our sky troops, as the first-generation paratroopers were described in the newsreel sent back to Canada, trained through the British winter and spring of 1944. On the evening of June 5th, the men of the Canadian Parachute Battalion boarded 50 aircraft and headed for France. Their first combat assignment, D-Day. The mission? A Company was to defend the flank of British paratroopers in attacking German artillery at Merville, France. B Company was to blow up 2 bridges on the River Dives, and C Company was to destroy a German headquarters and bridge and to neutralize German troops at Varaville. The British commander of the combined airborne force, Brigadier James Hill, remembered the Canadians as well-trained and highly motivated. He predicted the German defensive forces would be demoralized by his ferocious and bloodthirsty troops. But on that historic night, the Canadian paratroopers weren't sure just how many would land alive behind the beaches of Normandy, let alone how high a price would be paid to protect the massive Allied invasion that would launch the liberation of Europe.
Well, in the Second World War, the Canadian Battalion dropped into Normandy on D-Day.
Because of the diversity of the type of men in our battalion, we were the first, and were selected to be the lead the division in.
We went in as a leading element of a major force going in on D-Day.
The role of the battalion was to isolate the battlefield on the left flank. All the troops going in on the beaches had an airborne presence on both flanks.
In actual fact, the division had to do 2 separate drops. The 3rd and 5th Brigade went in together with the available aircraft. The aircraft returned to England and had to come back.
They said there wasn't going to be much flak going over the coast, but the plane shook. I can remember you could hardly stand up in the thing. It was shaking, but anyway, we got through this anti-aircraft fire.
The pilots that were flying the aircraft at the time most of them were very new troop-carrying crews and had difficulty in putting up with low flight into heavy flak, so that the drop was extremely wide.
And so the order came. They had an Air Force guy at the door, and he was because everybody had a lot of equipment on, and as everybody got to the door, he pushed them out as well as jumped. And so, but what happened? It took longer, I think, than they expected. And the first 18 got out, and he stopped me. I was 19, so the 2 of us had to sit down. And really, it was a kind of a nerve-wracking experience. We had come all this way, and I thought to myself, surely to goodness we're not going to go back to England after coming all this way. But then he went around again. He said, I think I'll make a second pass around, and the 2 of you can go. So we left. Now, the first 18 were either killed or captured or missing. Where they landed, I have no idea. But myself and the other person that was 20, we landed in a very quiet open field. And it was, but what happened was, of course, that the whole medical staff, except for myself, was wiped out in one fell swoop, in a sense.
Of the 120 men that went in out of bombers, only 35 men landed on the field, but they managed to carry out every objective.
Our objectives were assigned to us and were to be taken before first light when the beach landing people were to come in.
Our whole division was on the left flank to prevent the Germans from coming along the beaches towards the landing areas.
Tremendous planning went into it, but it proved, as our brigadier told us many times before operations briefings, he always said, gentlemen, on the drop zone you can anticipate chaos and confusion. And certainly Normandy proved that.
The men were scattered as far apart, which is hard to believe, but 40 miles from one stick to the extreme other. And as soon as the planes crossed the coast, the pilots, being a little nervous, started to take evasive action. And the men are standing up, fully loaded, all pressed together, ready to get out the door. And then the plane does a little dodging about. The guys fall all over the place. So now they're off course, and the guys are tumbling and all tangled up. So only one at a time go out very slowly. And the advantage in paratroop is if you go out close together, tight together, then you're going to land on the ground close together and you can find each other. But if you're spread out 500 feet or more, then you have, especially in the dark, you have a very difficult time getting together and doing anything. And one of the worst things that happened is that the Germans flooded a huge area where they thought Paris might go in. And we had a lot of our fellows drop in the water. Now, where the fields were, say, 3 feet of water covered it, it's not so bad. The men managed to get up. But if they dropped in over a drainage ditch that was maybe 6, 7 feet deep, They had 80 pounds of ammunition and everything. They just went right to the bottom, so we had a few guys drowned.
And about 1 minute after midnight, we were dropped, and I ended up in water, at least my knees.
When I landed, it was at night time, and of course, it was, to be honest with you, it was very confusing.
I expected to see some objects that I would know where and where to hit for the rendezvous, and there was nothing.
And trying to find another companion, I couldn't find one. There was nobody around. I was a little nervous.
We had gone through, a week or two of briefing and looking at models and sand tables and maps of the areas, but it was, as I said, I landed in this open field, and I really didn't really know where I was.
I had no idea where I was, but there were aircraft flying overhead, and I figured that, all right, they're coming from the coast, so I headed in the direction they came from.
There was nobody else around, so I sort of wandered out of the field, and then and found a road, and then tried to find some sort of a sign that would tell me where to go.
I think I walked almost all night, dodging German patrols.
One of the most interesting things that our battalion lost an awful lot of officers on that drop. A very high percentage of officers. But it didn't seem to make all that much difference, because the NCOs, we had platoon sergeants, were excellent men, highly trained, and they just seemed to take over.
Our heavy mortar platoon was dropped behind Le Havre, which was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 40 kilometers from where our original drop zone was.
An officer, a mortar officer, and signalmen landed near Le Havre, right by a German airfield.
They were all killed or captured.
That took the heavy equipment right out of our hands, because no artillery was available to us at that particular time. So it was down to just small arms that we had to utilize.
But it is remarkable, and I've always thought that the drop, scattered as it was, and you will hear countless stories of those who you will have interviewed, that they were scattered. But the battalion was successful by nightfall in having taken all its objectives.
And it was to the credit of all those young soldiers who were able to try and get themselves reoriented, to get back to where they belonged, to get to their company rendezvous and the battalion rendezvous.
And right down to the last man, he knew where he had to go to rendezvous, and they were hell-bent to get there, and most of them did.
The success of it was largely due to the individual initiative of the soldier who was there.
It's amazing that they did so well in finding their way to the RVs.
So you had, in some cases, you had corporals and sergeants who were finally able to put together a group, quite often from different companies, and finally getting to the objectives and linking with others to complete the mission.
We had the bridges to blow, a headquarters to capture, German headquarters.
The Air Force, who had been designated to come in to bomb the Merville Battery before the airborne landing, were about 3 or 4 hours late in getting to Normandy, and dropped several 1,000-pound bombs, and consequently knocked out a great deal of C Company who were to take the town of Aéroville. Consequently, about 35 men were available to put in that attack when there should have been 130.
One of the worst actions of that first day was in our company. We were in the colonel or the major, an officer, and 6 other men were on the second floor of a house overlooking a German strong point. They fired a Piat shell at it, and it fell short. So they got ready to fire another one, and the German gun turned around and sent a shell into the room, killed them all in the room. So we lost our officers and and 5 other men all in one shot. That was a pretty sad item. I hadn't realized how terrified a guy can get when I hear these shells dropping all around you. And you think every one is going to hit you right in the slit range.
You got to make sure your guns are okay. You got to make sure that everybody's awake to what's going on.
So I crossed some fields and ditches and hugged hedgerows, and had to crawl over one of our guys. A sniper had got him right through the forehead. That made me move a little faster.
We were completely without a doctor or anything at that time.
By nightfall on the 6th of June, as I've said, all the battalion objectives and all the division objectives, including Pegasus Bridge, the famous Pegasus Bridge, were sealed, were captured and secured.
By 8 o'clock on that particular night of June the 6th, when the casualty return from the battalion was sent into brigade headquarters, which was a daily operation, there were 117 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion soldiers listed as killed, wounded, and missing out of a jumping group of 547 individuals. So casualties were very high.
Well, we secured all of the small positions that we were secured.
And never gave up any ground that they once had taken.
We just sort of dug in and consolidated ourselves along a line along the flank until gradually the people started to move in from the beaches.
It was a success. We won the day, but it was a close-run thing.
One Canpara's bravery has been honored with a monument at Varaville, site of fierce fighting after the drop in Normandy. The 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion was the first Canadian unit on the ground in France. For that honor, though, they took heavy casualties, losing many of their officers. But non-commissioned officers stepped up, and under their leadership, the Canadians distinguished themselves under fire in a variety of combat situations. Between June 6th and September 6th, of 588 Canadians who jumped into battle, 83 were killed, 234 wounded, and 85 became prisoners of war. As one Canadian, Dan Hartigan, remembered, there was more adventure in one night than most men live in a lifetime.
For 6 days and 6 nights, the enemy kept pressing on that ridge to try and break out, or to break through to get to the beach area. Only one tank was able to get through, and they didn't get through too very far when they were taken out with a couple of our Piat gunners.
At that same time, the Germans were putting in a major attack on the eastern flank, and the German panzers and grenadiers had almost broken through the 6th Airborne line. The 40 of us joined the Brits that were being overwhelmed, and the shells and bullets were flying, and some of the guys got knocked off almost immediately. We came to this field where all kinds of ammunition, jeeps, and Bren gun carriers were blowing up and burning, and bodies all over. And we were told to dig in and be prepared for attack. And we started to, but the ground was very hard and was very hard digging. 3 Sherman tanks came up around. Damned if the Germans didn't hit them. Bang, bang, bang. The brigadier, he must have called in Navy artillery fire for support. And they did such a good job, they broke up the German attack. So we lost out of that 40, we lost about 20 of our men. And but the attack failed. So at the end, by nightfall, things had quietened down. Next morning, we returned back to our own line.
On the second day, that was their D-Day +2, I was a casualty. Took the first bullet that was fired at me. It was a sniper up in a tree, and I had cleared the area out in front of me. And I turned around to ask for more ammunition, and the enemy up in the tree delivered it. He shot me with a rifle, and he didn't kill me, thank goodness. But that was because my head was turned, and the bullet hit the back of my neck and skull.
Well, I guess the second day, that was the first bit of a battle. The Germans made an attack, and they started firing at us when they were advancing, and we opened up on them. And then we realized that they were just trying to find out where we were. We made a mistake. We should never have opened up on them. We should have laid quiet until they come right on us. The result was they now knew where we were, so that's when the shelling started. And they shelled us every day. Most of the fighting that I was involved in was, there are no set-piece battles and such.
The German army had moved out of the area to our front and had moved over to the Caen area to reinforce. I guess it was the 12th SS and the 21st SS.
We did move, I think, a little further south, because I can remember the city of Caen was supposed to fall in something like 12 hours after they arrived at the beaches. Well, 30 days later, it still hadn't fallen.
But it was some 10 days before one Canparo was taken out to rest on the banks of the Caen Canal, albeit still under the guns of the 88 millimeters of the enemy.
I can remember the night that the attack started on Caen. We weren't involved in it.
We were required to hold off any road transport that could get into Caen.
Planes, one after another, American and British bombers went overhead.
Because the Canadian forces, the ground forces, played a prominent role in that particular area with the 3rd Division and the 4th Armored Division.
You could hear the rumble in the distance. We weren't very far from Caen.
They did all that operations of running into the Caen situation. But by that time, we had things pretty well settled down.
By 30 days, they started to break out of the beachhead and move inland, and gradually the war became much more fluid.
We fought there until August the 17th, when there was a general breakout of all Allied troops. And the battalion and the division advanced right up to the Seine River.
Then went back to England for retraining and preparation for another operation.
I didn't last till right to the end. I got hit by a sniper on August the 7th, and I was flown back to England into the hospital. I was there about a month, and that's when, in September, when the battalion got back to England, I heard about it, and the doctor allowed me to go right back to the battalion.
We quickly came up to strength by taking men on from reinforcement, indoctrinating them, training them, so that by the 1st of December, we were right up to snuff. We were right up to measure.
1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, once they returned from Normandy, were those that were left. There was 187 men I was able to bring out of there, out of the original 547. Went on leave. We had an extended leave of about 10 days.
So everybody was on leave. I was in a theater with a couple of other fellows and in the Middle England, and a notice came on the screen, all paras return immediately to barracks.
In any case, Market Garden was Field Marshal Montgomery's plan to get into the heart of Germany very early and force an end of the war. By the time they got to Arnhem, of course, the Germans were ready for them. Of course, part of it was a failure, part of it was successful.
We'd heard about the attack at Arnhem, and we thought we were going in.
But we were in no shape to be going into battle again.
We were told we were going in, but I guess some brighter minds prevailed and they decided it was a lost cause.
One Canpara's role in the liberation of Rochefort has been recognized with a monument in the Belgian city.
For 3 months, almost to the day, the Canadian paratroopers fought across France to expand the D-Day beachhead. On September 7th, the battalion returned to England to study its successes and failures, to rest, refit, recuperate, and to train with reinforcements for another brutally challenging battle. The emphasis was on weapons handling, physical fitness, rapid clearance of drop zones, and brutally efficient offensive and defensive combat skills. They were prepared essentially for no-holds-barred street fighting. They needed those skills, for the tide of war had changed. The Germans launched a powerful counterattack, the von Rundstedt offensive. Then, as 1944 came to an end, the Canadian Parachute Battalion were sent back to the front to aid U.S. and British units in pushing the Axis forces out of Belgium and the Ardennes, in what would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. The battalion went into action in the Ardennes on Christmas Day, 1944.
Our next operation was when the Battle of Bulge started on December the 16th.
The von Rundstedt's armor had broken through between the Americans and the British forces that were in the area at the time, and were heading for Ostend.
The Germans have made it clear that once they have breached with their armor the lines in the Ardennes, their hope is to be in Paris and the Channel ports by New Year.
The weather was so bad as far as flying was concerned that all aircraft had been grounded, so that there was no air support for any of the troops that were there.
So it was pretty frightening.
6th Airborne Division were given instructions to head for the Ardennes. The commanding officer didn't know what the ultimate objective would be, so there was a bit of a confusion as to what clothing to take.
They'd never experienced a winter like that from what we hear. We can't understand why it had particularly that time to have that kind of weather.
As it was, we had no winter underwear, we had no gloves, we had no scarves, we had no balaclavas or things like that that would keep us semi-warm during a miserable winter. As a consequence, we went to the Ardennes in the same clothing we had been issued for the operation in Normandy.
The Met people, meteorological people, and the Air Force have said they can't fly. The Ardennes is closed in with fog and snow. The visibility is terribly poor. There can't be a parachute drop. Therefore, as quickly as possible, we are changing our method, and we are going by sea. On Christmas Eve, the 24th of December, we went by sea. The only time we went across the channel by sea.
We arrived in Belgium, and then we were trucked to the front where the battles were going on.
We were in the front line for the first time and on Christmas Day, and held that line.
Many of the American troops were wandering about trying to find their own units that had been badly dispersed. Some fell in with us, some fell in with other units in the brigade.
Cold weather was a real problem because we weren't dressed for winter weather.
And very few of us had additional warm clothing.
And hobnail boots bring in the frost and freeze the feet very quickly, so that was unpleasant.
So it was a tense time and perishing cold.
And you couldn't dig any slit trenches in the frozen ground, so a shell will hit the ground, they just send the splinters farther and faster.
Some of us sleeping outside for weeks in the cold, and nothing really happened to most of these people. It's amazing.
The first couple of weeks was about as miserable as life could get.
In my opinion, we had it easy because the Germans had just about exhausted their effort. Though the battalion right next door to us, they lost 65 men killed in one day, but are 4 miles away from us, and yet ourselves, we had very few casualties. The 13th Battalion, which was beside us, they happened to be on one of the main roads, a place called Buer, where a German column, armored column came on. Well, the airborne are lightly armored, and they only have handguns and mortars. They don't have much in the way to stop tanks.
We didn't have a contact with the Americans, but we were aware that to our right or south of us in the Ardennes, on that line facing von Rundstedt and the German armor, was the 101st American Airborne.
Well, the 101st were pretty well surrounded. They held, most of the German effort was going around trying to capture Bastogne.
They courageously held that particular town against all odds, did a fine job of it, and we were within about, I would say, 15 kilometers when some of us suggested that perhaps we should go in and see if we could help them out. After all, some of their battalions had men that were known to some of our men. However, we were turned down by the Americans because they wanted an American unit to come in to break into the perimeter around Bastogne and do the rescue work.
They took a bad shellacking. Anyway, they actually stopped the German column, who got discouraged and backed away.
It is not a highlight of combat and pitched battles in my memory, but one of having to live through pretty severe hardship from weather, and always the constant threat that you could be overrun. But later on, within 2 weeks, once the line was established and we went on the attack, and General Patton, an American Third Army coming from the south, relieving the 101st, went on the attack, that took a lot of pressure off.
The success of the battalion in achieving its objectives in Robon is commemorated with a monument in that town.
The 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion was the only Canadian combat unit to see action in the Ardennes. The Allied troops, many improperly kitted with full winter gear, endured and survived the coldest, snowiest weather in memory in the Ardennes forest on Belgium's border with Germany. Over 1 million men fought in the Battle of the Bulge, 500,000 Germans, 600,000 Americans, more than fought at Gettysburg, and 55,000 British, including the Canadians, Free French, and Belgian units. 800 tanks were lost on each side. 1,000 German aircraft were destroyed, 100,000 Germans killed, wounded, or captured. There were 81,000 American casualties, 19,000 of these died in the fighting, and 1,400 British and Canadian casualties, 200 killed. British Field Marshal Montgomery said the Battle of the Ardennes was definitely one of the most difficult in which he'd ever participated.
We had a good spirit in the battalion. We figured we could do anything.
They were thinking about what they had to do. They were thinking about that much more than worrying about themselves.
Most people don't really, I don't think, feel that anything's going to happen to them.
Everybody experiences fear.
Some fellows had a little difficulty with it.
I just felt that I would survive the war, that's all.
I wasn't particularly concerned or worried.
They were all gung-ho.
The guys were all hepped up for these operations.
And from that point on, the Germans, ran out of gas. It's now been established that their armor, they couldn't supply their tanks with gas. They hadn't been as successful as they had thought. And so they began a fighting retreat. The major city that we captured in the Ardennes, where we have a monument erected, is at a place called Rochefort.
The Germans had put in an attack there the day before, and they got a lot of the Americans by surprise. And our order was to immediately set ourselves up in houses, and in case the Germans were coming back.
So we were able to get shelter for the first time, even in barns or some kind of sheds, which was a great relief. The locals were picking up American soldiers who had been killed. And I can remember the ox carts, horse-drawn or by oxen, coming down the street of Rochefort with these frozen American bodies stacked like cordwood on the back of these ox carts to some graves registration area. And the numbers were astonishing.
We advanced until we came under fire from German positions, and we called in artillery on them, and then we get ready to make a major attack on their position, and we find out they'd retreated. So we would take their former position, and then the same procedure would follow. And so we went from village and town to town, staying right behind them.
It all came under control a few days after the battalions had arrived, and we moved up towards an area of a town called Marsh. And along that route, there seemed to be complete havoc. The roads were just black ice, and it was most difficult to keep the transports that were moving the troops up into position on the road.
As I mentioned, the cold was just fierce. Trying to keep from freezing was very difficult. Lots of guys pulled out with frozen feet and frostbite.
Our major problem was to really clear several American bodies. When I say several, I mean a lot, from the open ground near the town of Marsh, where the Americans had attacked over wide open ground, and their tank support was not up to par with the German armor, and there were a tremendous number of casualties. One of the things that we ran into on our way up to Marsh was the town of Band.
And a young woman brought in a little sister who had some medical treatment, and we fixed her up. And she was very, very thankful and so on. But the next day she came in and said, I wonder if I would go with her to see to some place where her brother had been missing.
And we found that on a night patrol, a basement of a house that had been bombed out was full of Belgian bodies.
The Germans had shot them in the head or the back of the head in reprisals.
We had captured this area, and then the Germans had recaptured it. And when they recaptured it, they, of course, took all these hostages of mostly young men who they thought had sort of betrayed them and did things, and took them and just brutally murdered them.
To think that somebody would be that vicious to go and take old men who were of no value to anybody in the form of a capable soldier, and young kids who just weren't able to do the job either, and just murder them.
The brigadier made all the troops have a look at all the bodies that had been taken out of this cellar, spread out on the ground, and said, now this is the kind of people you're fighting. so that, in other words, don't have any mercy on these guys.
He was very upset about it, as were all of our people, to think that this would be done. It was strictly an atrocity.
That was really quite a shock to me.
And there were all sorts of suggestions about how we would remedy this situation. In other areas where we did find prisoners of war, and after that band operation, trigger figures became almost itchy.
I'd never really seen anything like this before, after even dealing with all the wounded and dead of our own people. This was actually a terrible, brutal murder.
It was a pretty sad scene, all right. We were gradually moved off to the north. The Air Force was able to move again because the air started to clear and air support came down, and as a consequence, the German armor took quite a bit of a beating, and that was when we were moved up to Holland.
Holland was interesting. It was funny in a way. They trucked us from the Ardennes into Holland, and whatever it was, diarrhea hit the whole battalion. And it was funny that the trucks would stop on the side of the road about every hour for a maybe 10-minute break, and everybody would pile out of the trucks and down the pants in the snow, and a whole column of trucks, guys in the snow, relieving themselves. There is a photo around, but I've never been able to get my hands on it. And you'd have 4 bare behinds hanging over the tailgates of trucks going through these Belgian villages, and I thought, what a way to fertilize fields.
We were on the Moss River and sent patrols over to the German side, and the Germans sent patrols back to us, and so periodically there was fighting there.
Our brigade commander was big on patrolling, and we just had no rest at all. It was patrol, patrol, patrol.
And you make sure that you sort of circumvent a direct meeting with them so that you don't get killed. That's what we're trained to do, is to get in, cut into them, get behind them, and take them out. Capture them if you can. Shoot them if you can't capture them.
There was a railroad abutment, and the Germans had blown the railroad bridge into the water. And we could, through the girders, you could see the Germans on one abutment. We were on one and they were on the other. If we fired at them, they fired back, so it got a tendency to keep quiet. And then at the end of, around the end of February, shipped back to England, got reissued new equipment and more men, and then we made the drop over the Rhine.
A monument stands in Gonville-sur-Mer in recognition of the sacrifice and valor shown there by members of 1 Can Para. The men of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, the originals who'd survived D-Day and the replacements who'd joined the battalion since, returned to Britain after that brutal but victorious Battle of the Bulge winter. They had 2 weeks leave. Then, on March 7th, 1945, the paratroopers began training for what would be the last major airborne operation of the war, Operation Varsity, the crossing of the Rhine, the final assault on Hitler's Third Reich. The massive airborne glider assault involved the American 17th Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne, containing the 1st Canadian Paratroop Battalion. The operation, unlike D-Day's nighttime drop, was launched in broad daylight. The Canadians' mission: to clear the drop zone, to seize a farm on the western edge of the drop zone, to capture the village of Bergerfurth south of the drop zone, and to secure a wooded area near the road between Wessel and Emmerich. On the morning of March 24, 1945, 18,000 troops in 1,890 aircraft, 1,300 gliders, and with 900 aircraft flying protection, embarked on Operation Varsity.
I think the most vivid memory of the war for me would probably be the planning and success that went into our last parachute operation, which was the crossing of the Rhine.
That was the largest airborne operation of the war.
That was the operation when 6th Airborne Division was put in conjunction with the 17th U.S. Airborne Division to move into a position between Wesel and Emmerich on the main road up from the Rhine River, and we were to go in there.
We received a very detailed briefing, of course, in the concentration area prior to the drop, where every man was briefed 3 times in detail as to what to expect.
That was a daylight drop. By the way, Normandy was a night drop and scattered all over the place. The Rhine drop was a daylight drop, 10 o'clock in the morning, right over top of the German positions.
The night before the drop, we were listening to the radio, and we were told that the Germans would be expecting parachute drops across the Rhine.
The German general who was in charge of the defense area had decided, since it was 10 o'clock, there was not going to be an airborne attack, so he sent some of his men to the river to stop the Germans coming across, the Allied coming across the river.
I'll never forget this, the American pilot of C-47 looking at myself and my men loaded down with heavy equipment, and said to me, he said, I feel embarrassed dropping you fellows in an enemy position and drop in broad daylight. Seemed to have no concern for himself at all. At 5 minutes to the drop, the red light went on, and that meant the jump master got us on our feet. Stand up, hook up, check your equipment, sound off for equipment check from the rear to the front. 18 men in the stick. Then when the green light went, out we went. And out the door we went, and with about 5 of us still in the aircraft, the engine opposite the door was hit. And it was just a flash of fire from the engine, crossed all the windows. And this was a bit of a shock, of course, and I don't think I jumped. I was kind of thrown out the door. But that's my most memorable experience, getting out of that aircraft and thinking of that poor pilot. He and his crew were lost.
The Armada that we were in came 10 minutes early before our artillery had knocked out all the German positions or did as much damage, so there was a lot of them left to fire. And it was a bit of a shock when I came out of the aircraft and heard all these shots going by, and I looked up and see my chute, a whole bunch of holes in my parachute, and I knew that they were coming close.
As soon as my parachute opened, looked down, I recognized where I was immediately.
This was a case that the navigation was right on target. The entire battalion landed within the space of a football field.
We landed on the drop zone, under fire.
And this was planned, and the result was we lost quite a few men, but we had so many men in the air at one time, almost 2,000 men, that we just overwhelmed them. What happened to me was a gust of wind caught my chute, drifted over trees and down through the trees, and I got hung there about 8 feet off the ground. And I got jammed up, my arms jammed up, helmet halfway over my eyes. Couldn't get my fighting knife to cut myself free. And I hung there and watched all these damn branches falling as they swept the trees with machine guns. Anyway, lucky again, the 2 other paras came along, and Britt lifted a short guy up. He grabbed my ankles, and the weight of the 3 of us pulled me out. We all went down and tumbled on the ground. So I got out of that all right.
There were 3 houses on the side of the drop zone. I could see German soldiers running to set trenches near the houses, and I knew we were in for a fight right away.
We did lose a commanding officer who was a very, very close friend of mine.
I got out of my parachute harness very quickly. There were bullets flying over my head. The crack past your ears makes you wake up quickly. The idea and what we were told is, look, don't just lay there. Get on your feet and do something. And we were trained to expect this and to do it. So we charged this position and we knocked it out.
Our objectives were seized. and held within the first 35 minutes. All of the prisoners captured, everything sustained.
And by 5 o'clock, the battle was over, and the troops come from the Rhine and met up with us with their armor. So we had a little bit heavier equipment to fight with.
The casualties, while they were high, they were not excessive, and they fell below what was anticipated. But it was a superb operation.
To ensure the efforts of one Canpera will never be forgotten, a monument stands in Le Mesnil.
The crossing of the Rhine signaled the beginning of the end of the war. There were pockets of resistance and counterattacks, but as the Allied forces advanced on Berlin, the larger issue became the number of prisoners being taken. The Canadian CO, Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Nicklin, died in the Rhine drop, to be succeeded by the fourth and final commanding officer of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Fraser Eady.
The Germans were fighting a rear guard action to hold us up. They'd be going down the road and all of a sudden they'd be fired upon. So we'd mount an attack against them and they'd just disappear. This is something like what happened in the Band of Brothers, the 101st Airborne Division fighting in the woods. They'd advance a little distance, be fired upon, lose a few men, mount an attack, and these people would just disappear in front of you. It was very, very frustrating, but it was one thing you had to tolerate.
They even opened up at us with anti-aircraft guns firing horizontal. That was not a very pleasant experience. Anyway, they kept retreating as we advanced.
But as time went on and things got more stabilized, and the fighting got a little less severe, we did capture a lot of prisoners.
And from then on, things seemed to start crumbling a bit.
Matter of fact, we did capture a lot that we could have easily killed. And in the film, Band of Brothers, it struck me at times that there were men shot who should have been captured. Very often, too, you capture a position and with a lot of people in it and a lot of enemy, and you just take the whole kit and caboodle prisoner.
I took 2 prisoners. They were coming up the road. I told my section not to shoot at these people, that I thought they might be attempting to surrender. One of my people didn't hear me or decided to make his own decision and started firing at them. He didn't hit them. They went to the ground. But who do you think has to go across that road to find out if they're dead or alive? It was me. I went across the road. As soon as I had them on the road and they were safe, somebody started shooting at me. And he got me. He shot me in the leg with a machine gun. And so I I jumped behind a tree and hollered for a medic. And the medic that came to rescue me was a German. I had 3 inches of bone out of my leg, and he took care of it very well. But most importantly, as my guys were carrying me on the road, we were under mortar fire again. And as soon as the German mortar started to fall around us, this medic threw himself on me to cover my body to make sure I didn't get hit. That's a pretty impressive piece of action. Don't know who he was, couldn't find out who he was. He delivered me, went with the people that were carrying me and took me right up into the medical unit and had me looked after, but they wouldn't let him in the operating room. So that's the last I saw of him.
We treated the prisoners well. We saw that they were fit. We sent them back to the rear.
On our way up to the Elbe River, at a place called Bergen-Belsen, just outside of Celle.
We came across concentration camps.
And it was a shambles, I can tell you.
with over 3,000 displaced persons, most of them Poles, in it.
The prisoners in there were not in any way connected with military. They were an ethnic group of Israelis, or in those cases, the Hebrews, and were in absolutely dreadful shape. Our medical officer told me that they were losing somewhere in the neighborhood of about 215 a day of new deaths within the camp.
But boy, they were glad to see us.
The crossing of the Elbe River in Germany was our last final major battle.
And they sent one brigade up to liberate Denmark, and the other one they flew to Norway to liberate Norway. And then we were in the brigade that was to go right through Germany to Wismar.
We now know that once we crossed the Elbe, Winston Churchill had given orders to Field Marshal Montgomery that he wanted our 6th Airborne Division to move as fast as possible up to the Baltic Sea to take a place called Wismar.
Winston Churchill had found out that Stalin and President Roosevelt had made a separate deal that the Americans would not impede the Russians in going through that coast road along the Baltic as far as the Danish border. And Churchill gave orders that who was ever in that particular area was to get into Wismar before the Russians. I was the closest to the area that we had to go to.
So the idea was to advance as fast as possible. What they did, they took a battalion one day to ride on tanks. They would be the advanced section. Then the second group would be on battalion would be on trucks, and then the third battalion would be on foot, and they had to keep up to the tanks and trucks. So they almost ran to keep up with them.
The last couple of days before we got to Wismar, the German army facing us, a whole corps, were told to lay down their weapons and to head west.
Germans were marching down one side of the road to try to get in behind our lines and not be captured by the Russians, and we were going forward.
And they knew what would happen if the Russians got them. So I guess they chose the lesser of the two evils. We just boxed on and got up to a place called Gatbush, where an American armored regiment decided that they were going to cross our line and take our route up to Wismar. I had the brigadier with me so that I was fairly sure of my ground, and I just told the general in charge of that division that he better turn him around or the battle would start right there. We were going on that route. We were going to Wismar. He was on the wrong route, and he should have been going up on the main highway off Lake Schwerin. By God, he backed down. So on we went.
There's a village, small town just before Wismar. We were riding in trucks, and the front of the column was open, and the Germans opened up on them. So we all jumped, piled out of the side of over the side of the trucks. I tore through this gate, saw a movement, fired, and then got the shock of my life. Behind the hedge were all the young Germans with their bazookas and machine guns and guns aimed at our column. Their orders were that if it was Russians, they were to open fire. If it was American or British or Canadian, they were to surrender. So fortunately, but I guess what happened is one of the fellows that was on the ground got nervous and took off. And I just reflex, I fired and hit him through the head. But I don't know whether that was one of the last shots fired or not. Anyway, they became prisoners. The column moved off again.
We ran into prisoners that we could barely hope to contend with. We just put them on the road and said, go that way. and if needs be, we'll send a corporal with you. But we don't need any armed guard.
And suddenly we had these literally thousands of Germans coming back along the roads. We just tell them to dump their weapons on the side of the road and keep going. At that stage. That was an incredible day.
Some of them were rather funny when, I suppose, of almost a general rank would determine that he would give his sword to the general officer of our battalion, but we didn't have a general officer. So generally the troops would say, well, I'll take your sword and see that he gets it. Well, I guess that's hanging on somebody's wall here in Canada. We ran out of gas with the tanks at a town called Lutzow, just outside of Wismar. We had the spare gasoline cans from the transporters all moved up to the tanks, and the fuel that they used, that the transporters used, was different than the high-octane stuff that the tanks used. So when we started the column up again, geez, we went away in a cloud of smoke.
The heroic deeds of 1 Can Para are forever memorialized at Bougainville. For the men of Canada's 1st Parachute Battalion, the war ended with the capture of the German port of Wismar on the Baltic Sea. The final advance began on March 26, 1945. Field Marshal Montgomery told his commanders, "This is the time to take risks and to go flat out. If we reach the Elbe quickly," he said, "we win the war." Churchill, anticipating the post-war division of Europe, knew more than this battlefield victory was at stake, that Britain's Russian allies were going for as much territory as they could take. After a wild 6-week dash across Germany, the Canadian paratroopers, accompanying armored forces that were literally running out of gas, entered Wismar and assumed authority over its near-starving populace.
But anyway, we got into Wismar. The resistance was minimal. There were a few German soldiers around, but very quickly they surrendered. But we took control. Our battalion, the Canadian Battalion, were the first to enter Wismar.
As soon as our battalion got into Wismar, which is right on the Baltic, we set up checkpoints along the highway, as we knew the Russians were coming towards us, and we didn't want the Russians to go any further.
I first put a section there and then had to reinforce it with another section of men because we were suddenly overwhelmed by refugees coming from the eastern zone.
Well, the first thing they realized before any Russians came down the road were swarms of ex-prisoners of war. Some of them were Brits who had been in prison since Dunkirk.
Some of them were emaciated, badly treated. Some of them had been in concentration camps and had fled.
A lot of them were Air Force guys. And of course, boy, they were glad to see us.
But then mixed among them were hundreds of German soldiers of every rank imaginable who were coming through our lines and wanting to surrender.
A group followed us who were civilian administrators to take over the local governments. The first thing they did was to put up notices all over the city for everybody to turn in their cameras and rifles and weapons.
Now we were in the position of having to take swords, sidearms, Luger revolvers, machine guns, so that within 12 hours, when I went out to the roadblock one late afternoon, there was a pile of weapons beside the roadblock that must have been 12 feet high.
And you should have seen the weapons that were turned in. Old blunderbusses from 1800 and whatnot. The other thing was, too, that the population of Wismar, German city, were short of food.
And so they wanted care and feeding.
Great big loaves of bread like this. They weren't wrapped, they were just tossed in the back of a truck and distributed. I got a call one day and said, Bob, get your platoon or section down to a certain place. He said, they're dumping bread out for these civilians. The women are fighting in the lineup. And we still hadn't cornered all of these or collected all these displaced persons. And they just wait around behind a building and see a woman coming with a loaf of bread and take it from her. The things like this were going on for the days that we were in Wismar. It was just sheer pandemonium.
We were the only Canadian unit to link with the Russian army.
We had 2 or 3 fellows who spoke Russian.
And although we had been briefed on what to look for in terms of uniform, rank, discipline, and so on, we quickly found out that these were largely peasant rabble, terribly undisciplined, and determined to get into the city.
It was touchy for a while because the Russians wanted to advance through Wismar, and we said, no go.
And they said, well, you'll have to go. And I said, look, one of mine will take 7 of yours any day in the week, and if you don't believe me, try it.
They at times appeared to be more our enemy than our ally, until about 2 days later, some of the uniformed armored elements of the Russian army arrived, and they set up a roadblock about 50 yards from where we were. And then we managed some dialogue.
The ultimate upshot was when the 2 of them met, dear old Montgomery, the egotist that he was, decided that he would find out from the marshal how many armies he commanded and asked the question, how many armies do you command? I command 2, says Montgomery. Rokossovsky quietly said, I command 7. So that got things down to a fairly level. Things got sensible, and that was it. It was our base.
I know a Russian column came up where I was on duty and came up to us, and we halted the column, and they jumped out of their half tracks. And their crews were half women and half men, and they had wristwatches. Because they shot, they were really getting their own back on the Germans. And the worst thing is that they were feeding us this bloody vile vodka. They could handle it, but we couldn't.
On the way back to the unit, I was stopped by a woman on the side of the road. And she said, there's a train, and she pointed to a train off in the distance, a couple of 100 yards away, on the side of the road. She said, I have a trainload of women here. We were evacuated from a hospital in Rostock, and most of them are sick and wounded and hurt, and we have no food. The train has run out of fuel. The engineer and all the train crew have left us. We have no food. Our toilets are all plugged up. We're in desperate condition. Can you help? And I thought, oh God, what the hell can I do? Anyway, I got some of my men who could drive the vehicle, and back we went. So we loaded these people in. I went down and walked through the train. One woman was dead, laying there dead. And some of them were so far gone that we had to carry them out of the train. Anyway, we started out, and by this time it was pitch black. And I'm leading this gall darn convoy in a captured German civilian car. At one point, of course, no lights on any of the vehicles, pitch black. And trying to remember how the hell I could get back into Wismar to get where I wanted to go. And we got them all to this gymnasium. And got them settled. Thank God there was running water. They stunk like hell. Talk about human misery, you never saw anything like it. They were scared to death of the Russians. By the time I finished with all this, it was 2 o'clock in the morning. And I'm wandering all alone back across the schoolyard, and one of my men came running towards me. The moon was shining, and he said, "Sir, the war is over." That's the day the war ended.
I don't know, it was a kind of, I guess, a feeling of relief. And I said to myself, well, I don't know, I've survived, it's all over.
As I recall, it was a sort of an anticlimax.
Well, one really didn't quite know what to do. Everybody was happy. Everybody wanted to celebrate in some way or another.
And so there was no celebration at all. In fact, we were still busy dealing with the civilian population and the Russians, and a tremendous number of escaped concentration camp survivors who had made it into our lines, and they were terribly emaciated and badly treated.
And the fact that I got pulled out to go to the hospital meant that I was not going to enjoy the fun at the end of the war, the usual parades and ceremonies.
It felt very nice, because I'd been, shall we say, an active victim of the things that happened during a war. And I was shot in Germany with a machine gun. 2 is enough. As a matter of fact, that's overdoing it a little bit.
So we had to get out of there.
The men of 1 Canberra left an indelible mark on Bulford, England, where they trained, and are remembered with plaques both at the Garrison Church and at the Rose and Crown, where they spent their leisure hours.
The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, but for the men of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, questions remained about further service in the war in the Pacific against Japan. Most of the Canadian paratroopers hadn't accumulated enough service points, credit for time served in accumulated battle theaters, to immediately head back to Canada. And there were some who wanted to be reassigned to the war against Japan. But as the Canadians were repositioned to their original base in Bulford, England, orders came to return home.
What do we do now, and how do I go about extracting the troops out of Germany via England and back to Canada?
He was able to put together enough aircraft to fly us back to England.
The Canadian government wanted us back from the British 6th Airborne Division, and that arrangements had been made for us to fly back to England and to our base in Bulford.
The war was still going on in the Far East.
Although we had all volunteered to go with the division if they were to go to the Far East.
Some of us were still young and didn't have enough points to get back immediately.
There were 5 ships at Gurrick in Scotland that needed to meet a sailing date, and they were troop ships. And that maybe if we could get down to CMHQ, Canadian Military Headquarters in London, to talk to them there, maybe we could talk our way on for a few of the guys to get home, particularly those that had been there for 4 and 5 years.
And all of us on that train landing in Bulford after that shortened leave, which only lasted a couple of days, we were all quite convinced that we were on into another operation somewhere. So it came as a great surprise within 10 or 12 hours that Colonel Eady spoke to me and said, I'll talk to your company commander, but you guys are going to have to gear up. We're going home immediately. You've got 24 hours to clear the camp.
Word got around very, very quickly, and by gosh, they came back. So the things were happening so quickly, it was pretty hard to know how you felt, except it was really good to know that you could go about without getting shot at, and secondly, that you were on your way home, one way or another.
We're going up to Scotland, and we're boarding the Ile-de-France, and we're heading back to Halifax.
But we actually came back with about 1,000 men, nursing sisters, wives, airmen, Navy people, everybody, and us.
Coming home on the boat on the Ile-de-France, I met funny, I was walking on deck. There was hundreds of people, thousands on board the boat, and I was out walking one day, and I met a a fellow from the same street as I had who was in the Navy, and he was coming home. And we both looked at each other and we said, we survived.
We arrived in Pier 21 in Halifax on the night of June the 21st.
And we became the first combat unit to land back in Halifax, land back in Canada.
In column of sixes, we marched down through the city of Halifax. I'd been given the key to the city.
And so that's how we landed in Halifax and were given a rousing reception. But at that time, we were not part of the Canadian Army, and they didn't know what to do with us. And so it worked out well for us.
Back to the ship again, 4 troop trains, 1 to Montreal, 1 to Toronto, 2 to the west. And the fellas were back home again, and at their own depots, and back with their families. And that was really the highlight of my military career, was the fact that I was able to swing that deal to get those guys home before anybody else, and as a complete battalion. Period. End of service.
One can para was honored by Canada in September 2000 when a monument was erected in their name at Ex-Coelis Mountain in Alberta. The 4 peaks, each representing the major battles in which the battalion fought.
The men of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion had barely arrived back in Canada when Japan surrendered in August 1945. On September 30th, their airborne battle skills no longer required, One Can Para officially disbanded. In its short but glorious existence, the battalion had set a standard of excellence, never failing to complete an assigned mission, never surrendering or losing an objective once it was taken. Among their battle honors, the first Canadians to land on D-Day, the only Canadians in the Battle of the Bulge. They advanced deeper into Germany than any other Canadian unit. Churchill called them those formidable Canadians. Montgomery asked, what manner of men are these who wear the maroon beret? Every man, he said, an emperor. Comparisons were drawn appropriately with Shakespeare's Few, the Band of Brothers. Young Canadian men pathfinding a new military skill, drawn together, facing death in voluntary service. Some made the ultimate sacrifice. Those who came home were changed forever by membership in the most elite of Canadian combat units, One Can Para.
They had all been taught to function on their own, to function as small groups, to function as sections and platoons and as companies.
And your greatest fear, and my greatest fear, was not to let anyone down.
They worked extremely well together, and I always said that once we dropped in on Operation Varsity, the battalion had become purely a professional unit.
I think a lot of people have more courage than what they think they have.
In my opinion, there was none better.
From Normandy right through the Baltic. It was a buddy system. You knew everybody quite well. You were close to them.
It's like a family. Whole variety of people, all looking to be trained to do the same thing.
And that's what sustained us all through the combat, you might say.
When you see that the chips are down and what these young soldiers could do.
Some of the worst circumstances that human beings could possibly face.
And when they're put in situations, I think they just do what's right.
So we had a tremendous number of very, very good men.
The Canadian ingenuity is something to be marveled at.
So we had an excellent battalion.
As far as we were concerned, but we're very, very quick to tell anybody that would listen that we were just better than anybody else. And I was willing to put cold, hard cash on that statement any day in the week. They were incredibly good soldiers.
It's a good life. I have no complaints.
There comes a time when you have to fight. And the Second World War was a good, just war. You should fight for peace, for sure, struggle for peace. All of us, everywhere, all the time. But the time may come when you have to fight. And when you do, you should do it with resolve.
This documentary is dedicated to the memory of the battalion members who made the ultimate sacrifice for our freedom. Lest we forget.
In honor of the Canadian men who so valiantly fought on D-Day, June 6, 1944, and in remembrance of those who made the ultimate sacrifice, the Juno Beach Memorial is being erected at Juno Beach in Normandy. Lend your support for this most worthy memorial. Call 1-877-828-JUNO or log on to junobeach.org for more information.